Hi, welcome to Myers ASMR, and today we'll be learning about the history of jazz. Yay! Something I grew up with. My father was deeply obsessed with jazz music, so it was always piping in our house. We knew a lot of musicians. My dad hosted a jazz jam session for about 20 years, and I used to go there a lot, especially as an adult, and just met a lot of musicians. But, anyways, um, let me get into my tea. I combined two chai tea bags because both of the teas to me tasted a little weak on their own. So when I put the two together, finally I get a nice cup of brew. Not as strong as I usually like my teas, but at least it's palatable. Oh man, tea with milk and sweetener. And this one I used dehydrated cane sugar. I think I just love the process of having that thing dissolve. It comes in this hard like cake, and I bang it with a hammer to just break it up into little rock pieces, and then I take those pieces and I put it in, and I just love that whole process of having them dissolve. Ah, tea is just divine. Okay, well, let's get into this book, which I've already started on my own. It's called Jazz: An Introduction to the History and Legends Behind America's Music. It's written by Bob Blumenthal. It's well written, and it's a nice, concise history. My dad always felt that jazz music was the only original music to the U.S., so I guess it's true. Well, at least we have something to be proud of, right? That we can call ours. Well, let's start from the very beginning. Let's start right with the introduction. As we move from the 20th century, the jazz century, the music that has been called America's only art form appears more multifaceted than ever. As a result, defining this now venerable four-letter word is an ever more elusive enterprise, with any results destined to be as controversial as they have proven to be since the word jazz, or its early variant, jazz, first gained currency 90 years ago. We surely cannot hope to return to the first jazz histories written shortly before the Second World War and find reliable guidance regarding what the music has become. Jazz has changed, and despite occasional creative thoughts, troughs in which some have mourned its passing, is changing still. My dad was one of those who, he was a real traditionalist. He felt like jazz, in order to be called jazz, had to be in its purest form. That stuff from way back like the 40s and the 50s, and anything that was new, it's not jazz. So, but me, I realize that everything changes, it evolves, and it should. I go to a lot of jazz jam sessions with my boyfriend, who's a jazz guitarist, and they tend to play a lot of the same traditional standards. And I would just love for people to just let the music evolve and break out and do something different with it. So the language that we use to talk about jazz changes as well. The style that was originally played in New Orleans, which was jazz pure and simple during the 1920s, the Jazz Age, became traditional jazz about 20 years later to distinguish it from modern jazz. Someone should have foreseen the problems such a term invited, since it was not long before modern jazz denoted a historically specific style of the music. Indeed, present-day jazz is no longer called modern. Is present-day anything called modern? And only the most commercially palatable style of today's jazz is called contemporary. Yet the struggle to pin jazz down to capture its essence continues. The unabridged Random House Dictionary of the English language touches the important basics in its primary definition, citing the music's origins around 1900 in New Orleans and its propulsive rhythms stress on improvisation and increasingly complex harmonies as time passed. Other definitions remind us that the term has also entered the popular vernacular as a synonym for excitement. I'm all jazzed up. And excrement. Don't give me any of that jazz. Without alluding to jazz's most notorious early usage as slang for sexual intercourse, as in the Jazz Me Blues. This last, figuratively four-letter usage has struck some who create the music as so indicative of society's failure to honor both them and it that they have rejected the word jazz entirely. Some practitioners have made their own attempts at definition in an album titled The Pianist Jimmy Rouse called Jazz a Fleeting Moment, complimenting critic Whitney Ballett's more famous conceit that jazz is the sound of surprise. These notions stress the improvisational aspect of jazz, but does this mean that all jazz is improvisational? When Count Basie declared that jazz was nothing more than swinging the blues, did he mean all jazz? There was no mention of blues in the dictionary definitions cited above, and Basie himself recorded loads of music, including such signatures as April in Paris and Lil Darlin', that are not blues in structure or nuance. Basie's band always played with a propulsive rhythm, though so is swing the essence we seek? Not unless we redefine that term to include the more irregular and esoteric rhythmic terrain of the free improvisers, the clave of Afro-Cuban music that informs Latin jazz, the samba inflections adapted from Brazilian bossa nova and other international beats that jazz musicians hear and apply from around the world. You know, this music is close to my heart, although I don't even understand it. I grew up with it. It was like a background to my childhood and even my adulthood. Today, the formats of certain radio stations have led some listeners to believe that any popular music without vocals, and in some cases, any popular vocal music with a saxophone solo, is jazz. Many people who consider themselves jazz fans would argue that the music these stations play, often designated as smooth jazz, is really anti-jazz. Yeah, my dad had a big problem with that so-called smooth jazz. He couldn't take it. But for a youngster, smooth jazz was actually the form that I could take and understand. You know, it was more melodic, and it was just easier listening. That's the same basic position that some fans of the original New Orleans style adopted in the late 1930s when big bands became popular, or that many fans of the big bands took relating to bebop of the 1940s. And so it went in the early 1960s with the emergence of the avant-garde free players, and later in the decade when fusion appeared. All of this should teach us, if not the need to abandon all standards, at least a bit of humility. To say that some viewed big bands as the smooth jazz of the Depression era is not to argue that Benny Goodman and Kenny G have equal value, though it should signal that the phrase jazz orthodoxy has been and remains an oxymoron. A more interesting question might be why so many different approaches have been considered jazz at one time or another. There is something going on with this music, something beyond the conjunction of notes that speaks to the way we live and the way we aspire to live. You know, my dad, he was not a musician, like he didn't study an instrument, but he really emulated the style of the jazz musicians of the time. And he always had to be dressed up when he was going out in a suit, you know. And of course, as years went by and people were dressing in a way more casual way, you know, usually he'd be the only one somewhere in a suit, but that was him. He really loved the jazz musician's style. And I do too. And I find that some of the young guys of today, they still dress up a little bit when they play. And I like that. I mean, why not? If you're going to be on stage in front of people, you know, look good. Try to look your best at least. The progress of the music from the fringes of respectable society to the pinnacles of current culture suggests the magnitude of the change that this music has wrought. This is why the music's wider ramifications are an essential part of the jazz story, and why 2 points that the dictionary definitions overlook must be kept in mind as we tell the jazz story. Jazz is not just improvised, but in most cases also collectively improvised. Spontaneity alone would not distinguish jazz from, say, Mozart's piano concertos, which were originally performed with improvised cadenzas. Though unaccompanied solo performances have been created at all points in the jazz continuum, what really made jazz so audacious to its early audiences was the simultaneous invention heard when 2 or more musicians formed a jazz ensemble. The process is unmistakable in early performances such as those recorded by the King Oliver Creole Band, where cornets, clarinet, and trombone spin variations collectively. Even after the individual soloists came to prominence in the recordings of Louis Armstrong's Hot 5 and a Hot 7, each player in the band maintained a certain leeway. Everyone is also improvising in the Charlie Parker quintets of the 1940s and the Ornette Coleman quartets of the 1960s. Even the brass and reed sections of many big bands often worked without written arrangements and devised spontaneous background figures. When a jazz group is inspired, each member makes maximum use of this creative freedom within the boundaries of his or her part in the ensemble. And as jazz has seen innovations arise, band members have found new ways to be free together. Mutual responsibility rather than anarchy is the result. The tenor saxophonist Joe Henderson said it as succinctly as possible when he titled one of his compositions in one of his albums, Our Thing. For Americans, there's another sense in which jazz is our thing. Many have claimed that given its origins in the African American community and the predominance of African American innovators in its history, calling jazz American music gives too much credit to the majority culture. Yet drummer Art Blakey, one of the greatest and most African-inspired of the African American innovators, was fond of saying that he never heard indigenous music on his visits to Africa that met his definition of jazz. No America, no jazz was something of a mantra for Blakey, and indeed jazz may be the ultimate musical expression of the notion of America as melting pot. This may also explain the tension between jazz as entertainment and jazz as art that is an ongoing theme in the music's history. This view is consistent with the frequently expressed notion that jazz is a musical manifestation of democracy, with each player in a band contributing an essential part that creates a whole greater than its individual components. As the trumpeter Wynton Marsalis has been heard to argue most prominently in recent years, jazz may be the product of American culture that comes closest to realizing the country's stated political ideals. Yet, you do not have to be an American to play jazz. On the contrary, its enormous international appeal, virtually from its inception, has arguably made jazz the first and most inclusive example of world music. You know, my father deceased a few years ago, not that long ago, maybe about 6 years ago. It's hard to believe it's been that long even, but connecting to this music and going to the sessions, talking about it, reading about it, I feel like I connect to my father. And during that time period in my life as a child, when I felt safe, just being around my dad made me feel like everything was going to be okay. Well, anyways, thanks for listening. Like and subscribe. Catch me in the next video and may you find lasting happiness. Oh, and check out some jazz. The kind you like. Don't force yourself to listen to anything that you can't really enjoy. Catch you in the next video. Bye.